All right, thanks. One thing, I wanted to say before we got underway here is that, look, we almost have 10 people. This is, if we use percentages, this is a really big percentage increase. Because we only had 6 last time, and now we have, 10. There's almost a 50% increase. And here comes Bryce, who's only here because it's swimming season and he gets out of practice. And the same with you, Farron. Only here because it's swimming season and they get out of practice. But I'll take it, right? Now, if you decided, if you wanted to rewrite your Jackson essay, which we really didn't talk about, and I know that that might be helpful for some of you, depending upon what you scored on that essay, you can rewrite it. Now, when you rewrite your essay, and I have the form here, what you need to do is scrutinize 3 parts of it. The introductory paragraph, right, where you address the question, the topic sentences, and one of the body paragraphs, right? Now, in terms of that essay, the biggest problem in the introductory paragraphs was confusion. So they were confusing, they weren't clear. And you can look at my comments on your essay, and if I say I'm clear, or something like that, or what does this mean, or what are you trying to say here, then you can assume that yours is unclear, right? And so you had 3 areas there. You said that the question, the prompt said, the Jacksonians viewed themselves as protectors of, the Constitution, individual liberty, political democracy, and equal economic opportunity. So in your introductory paragraph, you should address that. Did you think that they were protectors of the Constitution? Did you think they were protectors of individual liberty? So that should be clear. And you shouldn't really use the first person. So if you say I, you probably shouldn't do that. You should say something like, although the Jacksonians viewed themselves as defenders of individual liberty, the number is just soaring now. Now we're just soaring. Individual liberty, economic opportunity. In fact, the evidence suggests that they were not defenders of these things, right? Then, each paragraph should start with one of those areas, right? So then, if you said they were not defenders of individual liberty, then the first sentence in that paragraph should say, although the Jacksonians believed that they defended individual liberty, in essence they didn't, or ultimately they did not, right? Something of that matter. And then, in your paragraph, you should have an explanation of why you're taking that position. What evidence, what occurred that would suggest they did not defend individual liberty? Now, the biggest one that people put there was the Trail of Tears Indian removal, and that's an area that many of the kids did okay. But in terms of the Constitution, that's an area. You can look at your papers. Many of you did poorly. Look at the Constitution. When you said, did they defend the Constitution? Right? They went in the cafeteria. Did they defend the Constitution? And more often than not, what people did is kind of talk about Jackson vetoing the bank. Right? Well, okay, how is that not defending the Constitution? Right? Really what you wanted to say is that what Jackson did is assert too much power in the hands of the presidency. He disrupted the balance of power. The Constitution had a balance of power, and he disrupted it by asserting too much power with the president, and then make that argument, right? And, that would be a good paragraph to rewrite. So who in here is interested in doing that has not? All right. Do you feel like you could do this now? You're going to have to go look at your paper. Look at your paper, and if you feel like you need more guidance, see me or email me, and I will address your questions, right? So take a look at your papers, and then see me or email me, and I'll address whatever questions you have if you feel you don't know what to do. And this kind of walks you through it as well, right? I apologize for not kind of getting on this earlier and giving everyone an opportunity to meet with me. That was my fault. I just kind of got tied up in the holiday. But go ahead, Braxton.
What do you think you want to be like
Well, you have to give them back by that last day of midterms, Friday, you know, that's the drop dead day, you know, I gotta have them back by then. So, yeah, now, here's an alternative, right? If you don't want to rewrite your paper, but you still want that 5 points. I was pondering this today. Remember, I was gonna go into a meditative state and ponder many things, but I hadn't really gone into my meditative state, but I also thought if you could make a thoughtful comment about this issue of what caused the Civil War, right? In particular, if you could email me what might be an argument against slavery being the main cause. Not an argument that you necessarily agree with. You don't have to agree with it. But what could someone who was arguing that slavery was not the main cause of the war say? What evidence could they present that slavery was not the main cause of the war, right? And if your argument in a sentence or two is thoughtful enough, I'll say, forget the rewrite. I'll give you the 5 points for this, right? So if you can come up with any kind of thoughtful argument into that manner, in a sentence or two or three, and you can make it an argument on that side, you know. And again, I'm not saying that you have to take that position, you know, that you have to believe it, right? That's not the point. You don't have to believe it. But how would someone who is making that argument justify saying that states' rights was more important, or that slavery just simply wasn't the most important issue that caused the Civil War, right? Okay. So either one of those options, and then now back to like our test that we're going to take sometime in the future. Well, I mean, sometime in the future at some juncture. And I was looking at this, and it goes way back. The first thing on this test is ultimately not the election of Harrison, but his death. So the first thing, this starts with the death of Harrison, right? Remember, Harrison was elected in 1840. He defeats Van Buren, and it was largely as a result of the Panic of 37, right? The Panic of 37 plagued the Van Buren administration. You know, the people were frustrated by bad economic times, and they respond by electing William Henry Harrison, an aging hero of the War of 1812, to the presidency. Harrison is the first Whig. Now, on a number of occasions on the test, I asked you questions that ultimately require you to know that the Whig Party at the core was an anti-Jackson party, right? So when I say at the core, there were lots of different things that the Whigs believed in. For example, Henry Clay, you know, believed in the American system vigorously, which was a part of what many Whigs supported. But what all Whigs were for was being against Jackson, which is a dumb way of putting it, but I can't put it any other way. That's what all the Whigs were for, that they were against Jackson, right? And Tyler, Harrison's running mate, John Tyler, was against Jackson because he thought that Jackson was dictatorial, right, in his actions. So Tyler, right, you know, is a Whig simply because he's against Jackson, right? Now, okay, so Harrison dies, Tyler takes over, and eventually Tyler's political positions are at odds with the other Whigs in his party. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, who want to promote the American system. Tyler thwarts that. He vetoes the Second Bank of the United States and other pieces of legislation. These are things that are vetoed by Tyler. And Tyler finds himself, you know, basically cast out of the Whig Party, which creates a situation where Tyler looks for an issue to rally support around. And the issue that he finds is expansionism, right? Now, although there are two areas where the country is going to expand, which are going to be issues in the election of 44, there is a question on the test about something called the Aroostook War. And the Aroostook War is a conflict between the United States and Canada. And so you would want to take a look at that. And that's early in chapter 17 in your text. But the two areas that are going to be asked about the test that are subject of expansion are Oregon and Texas. Now, in class, we talked about the Texas Revolution, the Alamo, etc. There won't be anything on the test about that. There won't be anything on the test about the Alamo, Sam Houston, and the Texas, the revolution in Texas. Questions on the test will start with Texas being an independent country, seeking, incorporation into the United States, and factions of America supporting the annexation of Texas. All right? Now, coming into the election of 44, Texas, an independent country, right, that had declared itself independent from Mexico, had advocates in the United States that wanted to incorporate it into the Union as a state, right? Oregon, which was jointly occupied by the United States and Britain, the United States advocates of expansion wanted to annex the entirety of Oregon under the moniker 5440 or fight, right? All of Oregon and all of Texas was the expansionistic position. Now, James K. Polk, a Democrat, is going to be nominated by the Democratic Party for the presidency as an unashamed expansionist, right? So particularly the southern wing of the Democratic Party is going to advocate for the annexation of Texas and generally expansionism, right? But northern Democrats are also going to support expansionism, and they're going to support expansion into Oregon, right? And I don't know that all of the expansionistic fever was intended to spread slavery, right? There will be questions on the test about the response to this. And the opponents of expansion, in many cases, particularly Texas, are going to be anti-slavery people that see expansion into Texas as a way of expanding the influence of slave power. Now, whether that's true or not is subject to kind of some debate. I mean, Polk himself really, I don't know, really thought about expanding slavery when he supported expansionism. There was the notion, and there'll be a question on the test about this, of manifest destiny. So when we use that term manifest destiny, what do we mean by that? Manifest destiny kind of encapsulates. Go ahead, Aaron.
Isn't that like the goal to have it from sea to sea, like all the way from sea to sea?
That America is destined to spread its institutions and values and traditions that are superior to all others from Atlantic to Pacific. And so there were those who advocated for manifest destiny. Yes. I mean, slavery may have been a part of it, may not have been a part of it, but certainly there was an expansionistic sentiment in the United States among some, mostly Democrats. Whigs tended to focus more on internal development, the American system. Democrats tended to be more expansionistic. In the election of 44, it is James K. Polk versus Henry Clay. Clay is narrowly defeated by Polk. Polk takes office very determined. And one of the things he is determined to achieve is the acquisition of California, right? Now remember, we listed those 4 things in class. We said he wanted to lower tariffs, and he wanted to divorce, the Treasury from banking, and he wanted to address the issue of Oregon, and he wanted to acquire California. Texas, by the time Polk was inaugurated, had already been annexed into the Union. And so Polk wants California. How did Polk originally want to acquire it? How did he originally want to acquire it? Yes?
He wanted to offer Mexico $25 million.
Yes, he wanted to buy it, right? And when the potential for a negotiated purchase of California collapsed, what did it appear that Polk did? Right? Now we say appeared because his apologists will say maybe he didn't do this, but what does it appear that Polk does when attempts at a negotiated purchase of California collapse? Yeah, go ahead, Rex.
Whenever it's like they kind of felt like the only thing of the war.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, did Polk provoke a war with Mexico in order to acquire California? Right? You know, what were the reasons for the war with Mexico? We know that after attempts to purchase California collapsed, that Polk moved troops south of the Nueces to the north bank of the Rio Grande. The Mexicans, in return, attacked those troops. Polk asked for a declaration of war, and the war was on. There are no questions on the test about any of the battles or fighting in the Mexican War. However, you should know the two most important generals because they become important after that. They are Zachary Taylor, who is a candidate for president in 48. He is a Whig general who is elected to the presidency in 48, and Winfield Scott, who is the last Whig candidate for president, who is not elected to the presidency in 52. Right? So the only two things you really have to know about the war is that those two generals made a name for themselves in that war. You would also have to know, more so, the peace, which ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, right? And in that treaty, right, the Mexicans agree to give the United States a huge territory called the Mexican Cession for basically $15 million plus. We picked up their $3.25 million claim that they owed Americans, right? So depending upon how you look at it, you know, it's kind of like 18 or 15 million. We acquired this territory. Now, there was opposition to the Mexican Cession, and most of that opposition came from anti-slavery people who believed that the Mexican War was provoked by a slaveholder to spread slavery. In order to address this, Northern Democrats are going to propose the Wilmot Proviso. You must know the Wilmot Proviso. Tell me, what is this Wilmot Proviso? The Wilmot Proviso. Who knows besides the instructor? Yea, you know.
It banned slavery in the Mexican Cession?
Yes, the Wilmot Proviso was a proviso to a funding bill that said, well, look, if you agree that slavery will not be permitted to spread in any of the territory acquired from this war, then we will fund the war. So it was a provision, a proviso, that the war would not result in the extension of slavery. Now remember, the Wilmot Proviso creates a firestorm. And what it does is it unifies Southerners and Northerners behind their sections. Northerners vote for it, whether they are Whig or Democrat, and Southerners vote against it, whether they are Whig or Democrat. So it immediately divides the political landscape on the basis of sections rather than on parties. Right? Now, the Wilmot Proviso is not going to be passed, but the issue of the extension of slavery is going to spill into the 1848 election, with both the Whigs and the Democrats attempting to circumvent this issue so that their parties can remain unified. Right? So if you think about it, if you go forward, and I'm sure you would not, but if you go forward, remember in the election of 1860, the Democratic Party finally divides. Right? Well, in 48, when this issue of the extension of slavery becomes hot, both the Whigs and the Democrats are national parties, and they don't want to divide. So they want to somehow circumvent this issue. And one of the ways that the Democrats circumvent the issue of the extension of slavery in the territories is to rally around the notion of popular sovereignty. Now, what did this notion of go ahead, Bella.
Like allow people to decide what would be slave state or free state?
Yes, the popular sovereignty suggested that the issue of the extension of slavery be decided by the people who actually move into the territory. Right? And so the Democrats rally around that. The biggest advocate is Lewis Cass, who gets the Democratic nomination for the presidency. But another advocate of popular sovereignty is Stephen A. Douglas, right? The Illinois senator who supports popular sovereignty and continues to support it right up until the 1860 election. The Whigs avoid the issue of the extension of slavery by nominating Zachary Taylor and just saying nothing. But a third party emerges, and that's the Free Soil Party. And the Free Soil Party is really going to be the forerunner of the Republicans, because the Free Soil Party is going to be for free soil, stopping the spread of slavery. So they take it head on in the election of 48. Now, in that election of 48, right, Zachary Taylor is going to win. But remember, right, Taylor's victory, there were 30 states, 15 slave, 15 free. Remember, Taylor won 8 slave, 7 free, and Cass won 7 slave, 8 free. That there was almost equally divided, but Taylor wins the election. And Taylor's viewpoint on the extension of slavery is kind of unknown. He doesn't really state it. He didn't really have a political background. He was a large slave owner in Louisiana, but they didn't know what was going to happen. Now, the big event that happens early after Taylor's inauguration is the discovery of gold in California. And the discovery of gold in California expedites the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession, because people flow into California to mine gold, and they need government, and the question of whether they'll be slave or free comes to the forefront. Now, when it does, California, at Taylor's urging, seeks admission to the Union as a state and decides the issue of slavery on their own, and they decide that they want to be free. So they are seeking admission to the Union as a free state in 1850. At the same time that California is seeking admission to the Union as a free state, New Mexico and Utah are organizing probably free. At that same time, the Underground Railroad in the north is facilitating, the escape of slaves to Canada, right? Northern states are passing personal liberty laws. There is a movement in Congress to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. All of these things are so heinous to Southerners that they are threatening to secede. And so we said that this sets the stage for the Compromise of 1850. And there'll be several questions about the Compromise of 1850. Obviously, the Compromise of 1850 was proposed by Henry Clay, and it had 8 planks associated with it that Clay invited the country to support, right? We know that Clay and Webster and Calhoun are going to have their final hours in the Senate, either supporting or opposing the Compromise of 1850. Calhoun opposes it and suggests that there had to be some way to protect the minority rights of Southerners, right? And the compromise was not enough, right, to do that. And you can see that in secession in 1860. The reason the South seceded is because they no longer thought they could protect slavery with some aspect of the federal government. The Democratic Party was the last protection for slavery. As long as there was a united National Democratic Party that opposed, the abolition of slavery, the South remained in the Union. When that party divided and no longer could elect a president or dominate the national government, they seceded, right? Well, what Calhoun said is this compromise is not enough to protect us. Webster supported the compromise at great personal expense. Abolitionists were furious with Webster for supporting the compromise, and the thing that Northerners resented the most about the Compromise of 1850 was the strict new fugitive slave law, right? The most important, if you remember anything about the Compromise of 1850, it was this strict new fugitive slave law, right? That would ensure that the national government would take over capturing slaves in free states and returning them back to the South, right? And Northerners saw this as complicity, that they would become complicit in slavery. Southerners deeply resented the Underground Railroad. Incidentally, there is a question on the test about Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, right? But Southerners, deeply resented those personal liberty laws that Northern states were passing, the Underground Railroad, the refusal of Northerners to comply with the Constitution in their view, which protected their property in free states. Right? William Seward is also going to speak on the Compromise of 1850. And Seward is going to deliver that higher law speech that says, look, there's something beyond the Constitution, the higher law of God, and oppose the compromise. Remember, the compromise fails, right? When it's voted on as a package, it fails. But what gets the compromise through is the untimely death of Taylor, which slave conspiracy people think he was poisoned. Part of the larger slave conspiracy is that Harrison was poisoned and Taylor was poisoned because pro-slavery people wanted, to perpetuate slavery. No evidence to support that. But Taylor dies, right? And Fillmore takes over. And Fillmore supports the compromise. Stephen A. Douglas divides the compromise of 1850 into parts, and it eventually passes both houses of Congress in September of 1850. Now, when the Compromise of 1850 passes, and it would probably be a good idea to look at all the parts of it. California coming as a free state, New Mexico and Utah determining unpopular sovereignty, Washington, D.C. banning the slave trade, etc. It would probably be a good idea to be familiar with all of it, right? Now, after the compromise passes, there is an attempt to kind of move forward. And that leads us into the 52 election. In the 52 election, the Whigs nominate Winfield Scott. The Democrats nominate Franklin Pierce. The Democrat Pierce wins the election, supporting the Compromise of 1850. The Whig Party fatally is divided, right? The Whigs can't support the compromise because of the fugitive. Northern Whigs can't support the compromise because of the Fugitive Slave Act, or Fugitive Slave Law. And so Winfield Scott is the last Whig candidate for president. Clay and Webster die in 52, and so does the Whig Party. Right? Now there is a question on the test about something called the Austin Manifesto. And that's a plan, O-S-T-E-N-D. That is a plan to acquire Cuba as a state so that slavery could be spread there. Well, there was already slavery in Cuba. Now, O-S-T-E-N-D, yes.
What party was Pierce again?
Democrat. I'm so happy you are interested. See, that's, see, maybe if you could get out of swimming by coming to first period, you'd be interested too, yes. So I'm happy you are interested, Bryce. Good, all right? Okay, so now Douglas is the one that is most instrumental in getting the compromise passed, and he also is someone who said, we surely shouldn't talk about it anymore, let's just try to move forward. But he's also the one that breaks that compromise wide open. With what? What really begins the unhinging of the Compromise of 1850? What piece of legislation, right, breaks the compromise open? Go ahead, Farron.
Kansas-Nebraska.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act was legislation, 1854, intended to organize the Nebraska Territory for the purpose of settlement, right? And remember, Douglas was motivated by trying to get the Transcontinental Railroad to pass through Illinois, right? and he needed to organize that territory. Now, ultimately, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did is divide the Nebraska territory into two parts, Kansas and Nebraska, and open that territory to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. So the first genuine test of popular sovereignty is going to be Kansas, right? So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which passes with great controversy and tremendous influence by Pierce and Douglas and the Democratic Party to get it passed, right, would open territory that had been previously closed to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. And by dividing the territory into two, there was, oh, there's our friend Dan.
Can I get those Roy pickers?
Oh, I guess so, Dan.
Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Wallace.
Yeah, sure.
Hope we don't have another one
Like
of
you
those
even
delays.
more, Bryce. Your stock is going up even more, Bryce. Yes, that's right. Yes. No, we're talking about Kansas and Nebraska, right? So this Kansas and Nebraska Act, you know, that was passed, would open slavery, or open that territory to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty, and in essence negate the Missouri Compromise. Now there is a question on the test about that. So Kansas-Nebraska negates the Missouri Compromise. Why? Fair, tell the kids. Tell the viewers at home and the kids why the Kansas-Nebraska Act, opening that territory to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty, negates the Missouri Compromise.
Because some of the territories in the Missouri Compromise, slavery wasn't allowed.
All right, I'm going to clean that up a little bit for you, but that is correct, Farron. Under the Missouri Compromise, slavery was banned north of the 3630 line. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, right, allowed slavery north of the 3630 line if the people who went there wanted it. This was something that Northerners deeply resented and saw as a part of a larger conspiracy to spread slavery, right? That, look, this was territory won for freedom, now open to slavery. This is a part of a larger conspiracy. The Mexican War was part of this conspiracy. Now the Kansas-Nebraska Act is part of this conspiracy. Now, one of the most significant responses to the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the emergence of the Republican Party. The Republican Party emerged as a response to the Kansas-Nebraska. It was an anti-Kansas-Nebraska Act party. And what the Republican Party unified on was stopping the spread of slavery into the territories. Now, the Republican Party is going to emerge in 54, right? By 56, they'll nominate a candidate, Fremont. By 60, they'll elect a president, Lincoln. Right? They're only 6 years old, right? But the entire basis for the Republican Party was undermined by the Dred Scott decision in 57. Remember what happened. In the election of 56, the newly minted Republican Party nominates John Fremont. The Democrats nominate Buchanan. Buchanan's big attribute was that he had been out of the country during the Kansas-Nebraska flap, right? And he was a Democrat, you know, that had a lot of experience, etc., but he was out of the country, really wasn't associated with Kansas-Nebraska. He's elected to the presidency, and Buchanan is hoping that a Supreme Court decision that was passing through the courts would resolve the issue of the extension of slavery, and that was the Dred Scott decision. Now, you should be familiar with the results of the Dred Scott decision, which was that Dred Scott was a slave and could not sue in court, but more significantly, that Congress did not have the constitutional authority to ban slavery in the territories. All right? Now, the significance of that decision was that now the basis for the Republican Party was unconstitutional. Because now, you know, there was no way that Congress could stop slavery from spreading. The court had deemed that slavery was permitted to spread. Right? Now, there are a couple of questions on the test that kind of fit into here on Uncle Tom's Cabin. The way that we organized your notes in class were different than the way it's organized in the test. And they talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin in conjunction with Kansas, Nebraska, right? You should know that it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe and that it exposed the kind of evils of slavery, and it hardened Northern public opinion against slavery, and certainly hardened its opinions about the spread of slavery. Now, you should also know the results of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was controversy in Kansas, right? The first test of popular sovereignty doesn't go very well. You know, I guess in fairness, both the North and the South on some level try to influence the decision of the settlers in Kansas, either for or against slavery. The North is with the Immigrant Aid Society and sponsoring free soil people to move there. The South is with people crossing the border and illegally voting there. And what eventually happens in Kansas is that you get two different governments, one pro-slavery, one anti-slavery, right? And those two governments are going to war with each other, and that war between those two governments is going to result in death and violence, and eventually John Brown's raid, you know, in Powhatan Creek. Now, the fighting in Kansas is also going to spill over into the Senate. And we talked about the caning of Sumner by the Bully Brooks in the Senate. That was a response to Bleeding Kansas. Sumner's speech was called The Crime Against Kansas. Remember when we caned Sumner in class? Do you recall us caning Sumner? That was a big day, wasn't it, when we caned Sumner in class? A very, very big day. But, you know, it just goes to show you kind of the heightened tensions that, I mean, basically, Brooks almost killed Sumner, you know, over an inflammatory speech over the spread of slavery into Kansas. And it kind of indicates the extent to which, you know, the situation had gone. There is a question on the test about the Know Nothing Party. Now, okay. After the election of '56 and the Dred Scott decision, which was good for the South, there were a couple of other things that happened that were kind of, you know, contributed to increasing tensions between the North and the South. One was the Panic of '57. And the Panic of '57 caused Southerners to believe that their economy was superior to the North because they didn't suffer. And it caused Northerners to believe that the slave conspiracy was inhibiting economic growth, that they needed tariffs and free homesteads and other things, and the slave-dominated Congress would not allow those things to occur, right? The other thing that happens is the Lincoln-Douglas debates in '58. And the two things that you should know about the Lincoln-Douglas debates are these. One, that it catapults Lincoln to being a national figure. I don't want to say Lincoln's a nobody, but he is he's a popular politician in Illinois, but not widely known outside the state. In '58, when he debates Douglas, in these 7 debates, he gains a national reputation, right, as kind of articulating the new Republican Party's positions. And remember, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are entirely about the spread of slavery and slavery in general, right? You know, and again, we say, well, you know, I mean, you know, back to this issue of what was the issue that caused the Civil War. Well, they didn't talk about tariffs, internal improvements, or, you know, anything like that in Lincoln's time. All they talked about was slavery, right? That was it, right? That was the only thing that was discussed. Now, okay. The other thing you should know is the Freeport Doctrine. There's a question on the test about the Freeport Doctrine. And the Freeport Doctrine was the way that Douglas preserved popular sovereignty from the Dred Scott decision. So the Dred Scott decision said, no, Congress or a territorial legislature cannot ban slavery. So popular sovereignty was dead. The territories were open to slavery, right? There was nothing the national government could do about it. There was nothing the territories could do about it. But Douglas said, oh, wait a minute, there is something the territories could do to prevent slavery, and that was simply not pass the infrastructure laws that were needed to protect slavery. And if territories refused to do that, then slavery couldn't spread there. So this was a way to abide by Dred Scott, but still give people moving into the territories the ability to decide the issue of whether they'd have slavery. So it preserved popular sovereignty. It kept, in 58, the Democratic Party unified. But in 60, the Freeport Doctrine hurt Douglas's attempt to get the unified Democratic nomination. In 60, right, in the election of 60, the South demanded basically that Douglas abandon the Freeport Doctrine and support a national territorial slave code, right? So where the federal government would protect slavery in the territory. Douglas refused to do that, and when he did, the South walked out of the 60 nominating convention, and that's when they nominated Breckinridge. The North nominated Douglas. The Republicans nominated Lincoln, and the Union Party nominated Bell, right? Now, I mean, although that flows there, there was one other thing that I didn't mention there'll be a question on, and that's John Brown's raid, which was before that election. John Brown's raid was in the fall of 59. And this is when he raids Harper's Ferry. So we know Brown's going to be asked on two occasions on the test about his raid on Powhatan Creek, and that's a part of Bleeding, Kansas, right? And then he reemerges in 59 and attacks the arsenal at Harper's Ferry, attempting to spark a slave rebellion. You know, now, part of the South's argument was, you know, look, this is dangerous to the safety and security of our households, and this is something that Northerners knew about, and some supported, and now some celebrate, as they deified Brown. Some deified Brown, right? You know, so John Brown's raid will be on there. But the last question on the test will be about the election of 1860, who the candidates were in that election, right? Sorry, I just looked down. That's not the last question on the test. The last question on the test will be about the Credendon Amendments. What were they? Yes?
The final attempt to keep the Union preserved by keeping adding slaves free to the Constitution, always protecting it.
Yeah, I mean, the Credendon Amendments were the final attempt at a congressional compromise to save the Union. By the time the Credendon Amendments were proposed, South Carolina had already seceded, right? And the Confederacy was already a reality. This was the kind of 1860-61 version of the Compromise of 1850 or the Missouri Compromise. The difference is that they do not pass. Right? All right, that's actually the final thing on the test. Thank you for an outstanding attendance here.